And then we can. Looks like you're not drawing any public interest. Sorry about that. At the moment, so,
Yeah, that's not unusual.
all right.
We're the lonely commission.
All right, so I probably have about, I don't know, 20 slides to go through, so probably a little less than half an hour, maybe half an hour at the most, and then however many questions you guys want to fire away at me. And I can show you, if you haven't seen the web page, where all the draft plan, the draft zoning regs are and the draft map. I'm happy to walk you through that as well. So kind of here's the order of business for the evening, kind of just go over, why are we rezoning things? Why are we changing the regulations? What are the big picture changes? Try to come up with some things that might be more relevant to your group in terms of impacts or what you might see once the new regulations are adopted, and then go over like a little bit about where we are in the overall process and what the final and next steps are. So the kind of like, I guess, common sense chief goal would be that we're looking to just kind of modernize the zoning regulations, make it a little more user friendly, and also align it with the citywide planner, also known as the POCD. You guys are familiar with the zoning document. When I first got here, going on about 7 years ago, was one of the first things I flagged was that the document itself is just kind of a convoluted mess. It's just disjointed in terms of different sections referring back upon themselves. And unless you're kind of an expert and you're used to working with the document, you don't know that you need to look in multiple sections to deal with, parking for a zone might be in 2 different places within the regulations, or something related to signs might be within the zoning district as well as in the sign section. So it's a little bit counterintuitive the way it's set up. And I think what happened was over time, there were piecemeal changes done based on what somebody wanted to do. They had a great project or something, so they went through the text amendment process, and that's kind of how it formed to its present day state. There's 31 different zones plus some overlays, including 5 single family zones. So that's a lot of zones for any community, especially a community that's not that large like Norwalk. So we're trying to make things a little easier to see, a little easier to visualize, and hopefully in the long term, once folks get used to it, easier to regulate as well. So here's the zoning map, which you've probably seen 1,000 times. Key thing on the left is the legend, which has all the zones, and you can kind of see it's just kind of a myriad of colors. Zooming in on the right is a picture of Main Avenue. And there are really, for a lot of areas, there's not a good rhyme or reason of why certain zoning districts are where they are. It's kind of like this use was here, so I'm going to make the zone consistent with the use, as opposed to identifying a land use pattern that you'd like to develop and then developing the zoning around it. So it's kind of like you go from single family to commercial to back to single to multi to single to industrial. It's kind of all over the map. So when we did the POCD in 2019, that within that there's a future land use map, and the kind of intent and purpose of that map is to guide future land use decisions for the city. So it's good practice to align your zoning boundaries with that future land use map. And it's not meant to be like a 1-for-1 specific correlation between the land use map and the zoning. But, because just think about that plan 2019, it's already getting close to 4 years old now. Just think of kind of the monumentous changes we've gone through in the last 4 years. So none of that was predicted when we did our plan. So things happen and you have to adjust going forward. Some key, policy things that we try to follow is we try to focus our development near our, major transit centers like our train station, around our infrastructure, and around our major employment center. So that's where we think we should have the most growth. And then as you get further away from that, kind of, taper things off and make it less dense. The POCD also recommends looking at different models. So there's, our traditional zoning model, and there's also a lot of things going on, and you've probably heard this term before, but form-based code. And we're going to talk some more about that going forward. So this map just kind of shows our major development centers in the city, kind of working north to south. Up north of the Merritt Parkway is the Merritt 7 office towers. That's where the city's largest concentration of Class A office space is. So the area to the west of Glover Avenue, to the west of the towers, was rezoned last year to allow more density and height through there, with the idea that, you know, we really want to make sure that if we can create an ecosystem of support for those office towers, it's good for the long-term economic health of the city. And that's done in conjunction with the new train station platform that's hopefully going to be ready a little bit later this year. Further south, we have the West Ave Wall Street corridor, which has seen quite a bit of development over time in terms of like what's going on right now with the Pinnacle development, which is part of Waypoint. And then further south is kind of where I'd say most of the action's going on, and that's South Norwalk in and around the train station. So the plan recommends looking at those two areas, the West Ave Wall Street area and the Sono area, as kind of the city's urban core. So we propose to consolidate that into a single zone. Two smaller areas of development, I'd say, you know, a little less intensity, but also important. One is East Norwalk around the East Norwalk train station. And this large yellow line runs through here, would be the Route 1 corridor. And the zoning, hopefully over time, will kind of correct a lot of the mistakes that have happened on the Route 1 corridor in terms of how the land was developed. Talked a little bit about a hybrid code. So our current zoning code is what's known as a Euclidean zoning code. And that stems from a court case from long ago where the courts upheld the abilities of a community to regulate uses and separate uses. So the idea being, I can't put a slaughterhouse or a gas station next to your single family house if the community deems that's not in the best interest of the community. So that's a common approach that a lot of communities apply, and there's a lot of merit to the reasoning behind that. But the form-based code kind of thinks of things a little differently. It thinks about the relationship of the building massing to the street, the landscaping to the street, what you experience as a pedestrian on the street, and it focuses less on use. It does regulate use, but that's not the primary driver of what you can do on your property. Form-based codes are also heavily graphics and table-based to allow you, more visualization and understanding of what's expected. And I think over the long term, that's helpful for the community, as well as like the development community or the real estate community. So they know, okay, I'm in this zone and this is what the city's kind of looking for in these areas. And these line up with the vision of the city. So this is what the new code looks like. This is, this page here is similar page on every one of the zones. This particular zone is called the CD3L zone. So all the current zoning designations are going to disappear. CD stands for community district, and 3L is a single family large lot zone, which lines up pretty much with where your AAA zoning is today. So if you're in a AAA zone, not much is changing with the new code. Most of the standards that are applicable to that code today are, carried forward into the new code. We've combined some of the single family zones. So if you're in like the AA and the A, you might now be in the same zone, but some of the A went with the B zone. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the map changes, but by and large, the single family zones see kind of the least amount of impact, except where we've proposed to take some of the single family zones and make them into 1 or 2 family zones. And that's been kind of a lot of the discussion for these outreach meetings we've been having. And I think we've done about a dozen of these so far. And that's been, like I said, a big, a bone of contention with some folks. It's been a little bit controversial. The mayor came out with some comments about it last week. So it's, it's very much on our radar. I'm going to show you this later, more blown up so you can see it, but what's in the regulations presently, if you're familiar with them, obviously you are, but in close detail, is each zone, basically, if you open it up, it's just a list of all the uses you can do in the zone. And very inconveniently, there are no page numbers and they're not in alphabetical order. So it's not very helpful if you're trying to sift through and see if something's allowed to be in a zone or not allowed to be in the zone. So the new regulations has a use table, which is probably over 20 pages or close to 20 pages long. And so across the top are all the new uses, all the new zones. And below that are all the uses that are allowed, and the uses are broken out by category. So I happened to grab the residential category. And what the table kind of shows you is there are different designations for the use, which you line up with the zone at the top. So the obvious ones are P for permitted. So that means obviously you can do that in the zone. NP means it's not permitted in the zone. PL means it's permitted with limitations. And at the end of the use table, all the items that have a PL are listed in alphabetical order, and it tells you what those limitations are. So if it says, large multifamily building in the CD4 zone's got a PL next to it. So you would go to large multifamily, which is in alphabetical order, and it'll tell you what that limitation is. I can tell you there are a few mistakes in the table that our staff has already flagged that we'll correct in the final version. So if you see something, please let us know. Hopefully we've already found that out. And the last category is the yellow, which is SPU, and that means it's a special permit use in the zone. So as you know, special permit use would be something that will go to the Planning and Zoning Commission, requires a public hearing, and there are additional standards that go along with that particular use. As I mentioned, there's a lot of graphics in here to kind of provide some guidance on what's expected. This is the kind of the residential building typology. So it ranges from what's a cottage to a house, what's called an estate house, a duplex, small multifamily, large multifamily. It gives a little description of what they are. And on the right-hand side, it tells you what zones they can go in. And one nice thing, which I hope you guys will like, is all these things have definitions. That's one major thing that's lacking in the current regulations. There aren't enough definitions for all the things that should have definitions. So all these terms have definitions, and it'll tell you, some additional criteria or standards associated with them. Further on in the document goes into a little bit more description on each one of these building typologies. So again, here's a house, which is kind of straightforward. It tells you the zones where it's allowed, how tall it can be, some things that are regulated with that house and not regulated with that house. And then moving on to some of the big picture changes, a little bit of what I talked to. So kind of in your AAA zone right now, which is, think about the kind of the perimeter of the city, there aren't a lot of changes. And the reason we didn't put a lot of changes there is because, based on some of the principles I mentioned, there really isn't infrastructure in these areas. Most of the houses are on private well. They have their own septic system. They're not located near major job centers or transit hubs. So it doesn't make sense to add density in those areas because it doesn't, it just doesn't, from just a smart growth, common sense point of view. We've consolidated the AA and a big chunk of the A zone. And then some of the B zone went with that as well. And then we've combined some of the B zone with the existing C zone. So the C zone allows 1 or 2 family, and that gets converted into what's called the CD3 zone, which is a 1 or a 2 family zone. And obviously we're not making people build 2 family houses. They have the option of building 1 or 2 family houses. From staff's perspective, we don't view it as an increase in density because all the B zone properties now are allowed to have accessory dwelling units, whether they're attached or detached. We think the ADUs actually, the 2 family dwellings will actually lead to a more uniform design scenario over time, because if you have a detached ADU that can be in the backyard, it can be technically closer to the property line. It might be more impactful if you have like a pool in your backyard and your neighbor's got an ADU with folks living there and doing their own thing in the backyard. Whereas the 2 family is regulated by the form-based code, so it dictates where the building has to be. You're required to have 4 on-site compliant parking spaces located either at the side or the rear of the building. And another thing which could happen, and I'm not guaranteeing it will, but if you have a 2 family dwelling, it does provide the opportunity for home ownership. So somebody could own half of a duplex, for example, and somebody could own the other half. And obviously the price point of entry for half of a duplex is considerably less than somebody buying a single family house. So we think that's another benefit. And again, we're not saying it will. Historically, from what we've seen, looking at the existing C zone, which is the 1 or 2 family zone presently in the city, less than half of the properties that are legally eligible to build a 2-family have done so. So they've remained single families. And what is really driving that is the market. The market's saying 1 family is worth more here, so we're going to stay with the 1 family. I mentioned a little bit earlier, and I'll show you on the map. We've proposed to consolidate the area West Ave Wall Street with South Norwalk. This kind of shows you a little bit of zoom in on the map. The map on the left is the proposed regulation, zoning map regulation. This purple / periwinkle color here is the new proposed CD5 zone, which is the city's urban core. And that runs from basically kind of the Route 1 cross street area down through West Ave into the South Norwalk area, which was rezoned for like more of a TOD style zone about 3 or 4 years ago. The other thing to point out on here is this green color. That is what's called the civic zone, and that's meant to handle governmental properties, with the idea being that these are city uses and city properties, so they need to be looked at a little differently. But we've also put in safeguards so that if you're in a residential area and you're next to one of these civic zone properties, it's not going to negatively impact your property, like the city's going to build a school 20 feet from the property line. So we put in safeguards to handle that. And I think it's a pretty clear contrast between the map on the right, which is the existing regulations. And you can see from that same geography, which kind of starts up here and ends down here, there's 6 or 7 zones in this one small area. Many of these areas are very duplicative in terms of what the rules allow. I think it was part of a kind of a past master planning activity that never really quite developed the way I think it was intended to develop. So we've tried to simplify it and then make a unified zone with one set of rules, so it's consistent and identifiable. Some other changes we've done that will obviously come to your attention at some point in time. Right now, we have a business number 1 and a business number 2 zone, which comprise Westport Ave, Connecticut Ave, and Main Ave. I have no idea why we have 2 separate zones, which basically do the exact same thing. So we've consolidated that zone into a single zone, which is going to be called the CD4C. And what the hybrid code will do over time, and this area will be strictly in the form-based portion of that, will be, I think, Route 1 won't look like Route 1 looks like now and this is, I'm talking 30, 40 years, so probably long after I've stopped doing any planning and zoning work. But the idea will be that when you go down Route 1, you're not going to see a sea of asphalt in front of all these properties. Buildings will be closer to the street. The building design will look a lot more similar, should be more attractive. Streetscape should be more unified in terms of the signage, in terms of the sidewalk, the materials, the planting materials, where the curb cuts go. It should look a lot better and hopefully be a lot more pedestrian friendly over time. We've also proposed to consolidate what's known as the D residence zone now, which is kind of a less dense multifamily zone with the neighborhood business zone, because the zones are pretty similar. The 2 big differences are the D zone allows for 1 additional story of height, but they have the same allowed density, and the neighborhood businesses allows some commercial uses. So we propose to consolidate those zones, but we put caps in on the size of any commercial use that can go in there, with the idea being that the areas can potentially be more walkable over time, and you can have more small shops and businesses in proximity to where people actually live. So some of the services and needs you can get through walking, as opposed to having to take a vehicle to get at those things. I mentioned the civic zone already, so I won't recap that. On the draft zoning map, there are some areas along the waterfront that are labeled TBD, so that's to be determined. We've been having some pretty vigorous conversations with Common Council on what to do with some of those properties. I'm hoping to have a resolution within a month or so. So the final zoning map that'll go out to the public will show what the city's intention is for those properties. And some other changes, which I think you guys will definitely see over time. We're no longer regulating how tall a building is based on a height measurement. It's really based on the number of stories, because most people actually perceive by stories, they don't perceive by height, because if you think about, if you have a ground level, that ground level has a series of windows, the middle portion of the house has a series of windows, and then there's an upper level that also can have a series of windows. So you perceive these floors, you don't perceive height. Most people can't tell the difference between 30 feet or 35 feet unless they're maybe standing like right underneath it. We do regulate how tall the building can be, though, because you regulate that internal floor space within that that particular building. We're removing the building coverage calculation and going to an impervious surface coverage. So that's going to look at all the hardscape as well as the amount of space the building occupies. And the reason for that is right now we can't tell somebody they can't pave their whole piece of property. So this will hopefully lead to less impervious surface over time and improve natural drainage and less runoff onto other properties. These existing regulations are silent as to what you can do on your property in terms of grading, tree removal, or vegetation removal. These new regulations have a series of standards that tell you if you live next to somebody and they decide to knock their house down, they can't mound up their property 10 feet and then shed all the water off onto your property. So there are now standards going to be in place that dictate what that slope is and should prevent some of those kind of scenarios in the future. There are more regulation and standards on the type of lighting and how that lighting can be implemented on your property. So you're not, directly pointing your, spotlights right on your neighbor's property and lighting up the whole backyard. The Planning and Zoning Commission, as well as the Common Council, has been pushing us to increase sustainability within projects. So there's more sustainability standards built into the regulations. A pretty simple one is requiring solar on certain size buildings and certain size parking lots. So that's going to have to come into play and be a requirement for all projects. We have made revisions to the flood zone regs, as you've probably gotten variances in the past. For our flood zone regs, our regs are probably the strictest in the state. And you could definitely make the argument that that's a good thing, but there's been a lot of pushback. So we've still kept, I think, the integrity of the regulations, but tried to loosen it up to be a little bit more flexible. And we're putting in different standards regarding what's required for public notification, because we do get complaints about certain projects sometimes, and somebody will say, well, we didn't know anything about it, we were never notified. So we're increasing the notification distance, and then certain application types are also going to be required to provide a physical sign on the property pointing you to there's something going on here, you need to go to this place to find out what's actually going on. And I think that should help with communication going forward. So some things maybe that are going to also directly impact you guys. So there's lots of new terminology. So you are starting from scratch. So when everybody I say, well, it's going to be easier, definitely not going to be easier when you first look at it. I'm not going to lie to you. It's new terminology, new things. I'm almost 100% certain there are certain standards and concepts in here that probably aren't going to work right away. And we're probably 6 months into this process, we're going to have to take kind of a second look at things and then try to correct some of the mistakes we made. So I'm not promising it's going to be 100% workable right off the bat, but some of these things we don't know until we actually start to implement them. Good to point out too that as part of the peer review process for this, we had a second land use attorney that was a Connecticut land use attorney look through our regs and made a lot of suggestions and comments that we incorporated. We sent this out to some of our peer review communities, Darien, Fairfield, and Stratford, and Danbury provided comments on some other aspects of the regulations, which was helpful. Overall, there's really little change into what your responsibilities are today. We have proposed to take out the 2-year use exemption that's in the regulation. I think that's kind of legally problematic. And I think it could kind of circumvent enforcement in certain circumstances. So we think it's a good idea to remove that. But other than that change, I think your rules are, and your kind of Duties are largely unchanged. We did update the language a little bit to be more consistent with what the current statutory language is, but other than that, no real change. I was trying to think about like what you guys might see for variances, with these new changes. One change that we've proposed is to eliminate the minimum lot area standard and just regulate by lot width, because most people perceive things by lot width. It's hard to tell somebody what an acre of land is, but I can walk down the street and see how wide somebody's property is. I don't know how deep it is, but I know how wide it is. I know how far it is from the property lines and where the other person's property probably starts. So I imagine at some point you might see variances for that lot width standard. I think that might surprise some people once it's actually implemented. The setbacks are pretty similar to what they are now, so that shouldn't really impact things at all, even with the consolidation of the single family zones, because we're going to have some language in there that kind of grandfathers existing structures in. So I definitely don't want you guys to get 500 variance applications for setbacks just because we changed the zone. That's the last thing we're looking to do. And again, I don't want to say you won't see more work. I can't say that you won't or you will. It's just a little bit of an unknown at this point in time. But overall, like the intent of this, and again, this is over time, is just to provide more uniform and consistent regulations, which hopefully over time would actually lead to fewer variance requests because there's more certainty built into the regulations themselves. So kind of where we are, we're at the top there. We're in May. We're doing all these different outreach meetings. I was at the District A Council meeting last night, talking to some folks there. We have a couple additional neighborhood meetings set up. I think maybe 1 or 2 next week, and then a couple more after that. We're also looking to do kind of like a professional day or working session, if inviting architects, engineers, all the folks attorneys who deal with this stuff who might have questions. And I think that'll be a big help to us as well. Planning and Zoning Commission is holding 2 hearings, one June 21st and one June 28th, to get feedback from the public on what they think so far. And we're not looking to really do any adoption till the end of September, early October. So it's definitely not rushing things through. We're probably going to do a sustainability roundtable at one of those meetings, but I haven't quite nailed that down yet. And the idea will be that the regulations will be effective, hopefully January 1 of 2024. So what we're doing is, say the regulations are effective sometime in October, approved sometime in October. We're giving folks a couple of months to figure out what they want to do in terms of application. So, some of these people have been living with these properties with the current rules for years. So it's fair, I think, to give them an opportunity if it's more advantageous for them under the current zoning to go forward with a project, as opposed to just, making the rules effective immediately. Or otherwise they can choose to wait until January and then come forward with their project at that time. And we also have to make edits to the document. So we do need a little bit of time to incorporate those edits. That was all I have. Would you like me to walk you through the website at all? Unless you haven't seen it yet.
How many of our land use attorneys that frequently visit us have been briefed on this?
Not in a specific briefing. They're all aware of it because they've all made comments so far. So that much I'm positive of.
If you could ask them at some point in time, earlier in the process, the better, what they think the impact on requests for variances and special exceptions will turn out to be.
Sure.
I don't know that anyone answered your question. I would like to be walked through it if nobody else minds.
Sure. Let me do that. All right. Okay, so all you have to do is Zoom always seems to block everything I need to click on all the time. So just Google City of Norwalk Planning and Zoning. That will take you to our landing page. There is the second tab down and also this banner here, zoning regulations update. So you just click that. So this is just kind of like a preamble of why are we doing this? If you scroll down just below that, there's a series of informational sheets which cover a lot of the things I talked about, some of it in a little bit more detail. First one is what is form-based zoning and why are we doing this? The second one kind of provides some guidance on the differences between the bulk and height standards in the existing regulation and what's proposed. This sheet here kind of talks about some of the differences with the zoning map and why we made some of the changes we've made. This one here talks about the schedule and outreach. This page is actually going to get updated as soon as your Zoom link is posted to the YouTube page. So what we've done is we've taken all the zoning outreach meetings. Not all of them were recorded, unfortunately, but all the ones that had recordings, we were providing the links to the recordings. For the ones that didn't have recordings, we're putting the PowerPoint presentation there. So you can fact check and make sure I'm telling the same thing to every other group that we're talking to. Not always going to be me. Brian Baker in my office has done a lot of these. So you can go back and, watch any of the other neighborhood meetings to see what the public's response has been at some of these meetings. Next sheet talks about changes to the flood hazard zone overlay, as well as changes to the Coastal Area Management Act. What we're proposing and talking about for sustainability, and what the new grading, drainage, and vegetation standards are. You probably saw last week that the mayor had come out with some concerns related to some of the proposed upzoning changes. We haven't kind of run those through the powers that be yet, but staff has made a series of recommendations on, kind of some modification to the draft map. And I think we'll have that probably up within a week or 10 days, and which we'll have the map up and show you what the differences are. Something, to point out, for us, it was always a draft map. Where the lines on the map ultimately end up, to me, was less important at the beginning. I wanted to make sure we got the zoning districts correct. And so we can move the lines around at any point in time. Right below the information sheets is a place for you to provide feedback. So you just click on the link there or the one on the right. It takes you to this page, which basically asks kind of like, okay, first question is who you are. Second question is what's your question related to? And these articles are basically the chapters of the regulation. So you just click on Article 4. I want to talk about the two-family zone, and then you would put your comment. Steve, your two-family zoning idea is terrible. You're an idiot. Whatever you want to say there, it's fine. I promise we're not going to edit anybody's comments. Our goal within the next week to 10 days is to download all the comments we received, plus the ones we're getting through email, and then separate correspondences. We're going to upload those to a master spreadsheet, provide a staff response to each one of those comments, upload that so the commission and the public can see what's been said. And ultimately, the commission will have to sift through those comments and make a determination on, yes, this comment is valid. B, no, we think the change proposed is correct. And that'll ultimately lead to the final draft recommendations. Right below that is the actual regulations themselves. We put it up in two ways. The bottom right one is the complete link. So it's a big document with a lot of graphics, so it takes a little bit to open. So you could also just open it up by the different chapter. One thing that we didn't factor into our budget, which I wish we did, was going through the document and making sure it has all the proper hyperlinks. So after the regulations are adopted, one unfortunate soul in our office is going to have to go back in and hyperlink all the terms, definitions, anything that's highlighted, and we'll get that done, but just wasn't able to do that in this draft. And the last thing I want to show you here at the very bottom is the draft zoning map. The map on the left is a static PDF. It's similar to what you would see right now with the zoning map. You just click on it and you have to zoom in, zoom out. This one I think works really well. And credit to Amelia in my office for putting this together. So this is an interactive map. There's a little disclaimer that pops up. You click yes. Does anybody want to volunteer an address?
Nobody wants it.
I'll put it in City Hall. How about that? So that's 125 East Avenue. Keep in mind, this pulls from an Esri GIS database. So you can get East Avenue in Fairfield. You can get Norwalk, California. So make sure you click on Norwalk, Connecticut. Since this is kind of my test dummy, it pops up all the time. So up pops the map and you're at City Hall. It tells you kind of here's the zoning map. All you have to do is click on the property just next to it. And so a tab pops up. In this case, it's a little goofy why. Sometimes it pops up the existing zoning first. Sometimes it pops up the proposed zoning first. We have no idea why, and we can't figure out how to fix it. So we stopped trying to fix it because it works either way. In this case, it works well because the existing zoning pops up. City Hall is now in the East Avenue Village District, or EVD. So you could click here to take you to the zoning regulation section where that is governed by. Just below that is the schedule of the bulk and height for that zone. And maybe more importantly, up top, there's a little arrow. Just click that arrow. And that takes you to the proposed zoning. So you were in the EVD, now you're in what's called the Civic District. You click on that tab. That's going to take you to the Civic District. So there's a little preamble language, and then it takes you down into all the applicable standards for that zone. And that's constant with all the different zones. Below that is the use table tab. So this is kind of like the explanatory text for the use table. This is that table I was showing you kind of early on, where it has all the zones at the top, starting with CD3L, which is kind of the most rural, I would say suburban / rural in Norwalk, down to the civic zone. So this happens to start at the residential uses. So all the uses are kind of lumped together. And you could see that in this zone, the CD3L, a rooming house is not permitted. And it's not permitted in most of these zones, except for certain zones by special permit use. There are like congregate housing, which is like nursing home, that's permitted with limitations in certain zones. And then some things have SPU for special permit. And then some things like an easy one is like a live work building is permitted as of right in a commercial zone. So that's kind of how that table works when you click on the zoning map. And I think that that's one of the few really simple things we've done throughout this process is put that map together. That's all I have in terms of presentation. I'm happy to go back through any of the slides we put up or take any questions that you have.
One of the things we have been seeing, not with incredible frequency, but maybe 8 or 9 or 10 times a year, are self-created hardships. And it's everything from people excavating their front yard, changing the height of buildings, building garage in the front yard setback. Is there any greater enforcement of these essentially lack of permit structures?
So anything in terms of enforcement doesn't get really impacted by this because the citation fine process that the city has in place is all based on state statute. And the maximum like fine amount that we can levy is dictated by statute. So we're at the maximum that we can do. I think it's just easier for folks sometimes to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Oh, yeah. I'll ask another question. I know the city is starting to embark even slowly on an effort to document all the historic structures in Norwalk, to try to get a hold on unpermitted demolition, alteration of historic structures. Is there going to be an effort to coordinate the change in the zoning regulations with this survey or collection of documented historic structures?
I wouldn't say necessarily with the survey. Actually, at the meeting I was at last night, Todd Bryant was there. He talked about some different methods used elsewhere in terms of things that were implemented into the zoning code. So he's going to send me on some ideas and thoughts he had. Actually, the Planning and Zoning Commission, we have an amendment that's been on the books for like 4 years where we get in certain zones because it works better in multifamily or commercial zones. I don't know, it's a little trickier to implement in a single family zone, but we've put in provisions where if you keep the historic structure, we'll give you a bonus density or a bonus or reduction in heights, reduction in setbacks, reduction in parking, some kind of incentive to keep the historic building, but we'll give you something on the back end. And
Yeah, that's something I've talked to Todd about. And as far back as 1980, I was working with those regulations, historic overlay zone down in Greenwich.
Yeah.
So I think it was used very effectively there. And I'd like to see it more in Norwalk.
Yeah, the one project that was done most recently, which I think came out really nice, was the one at 3 East Wall Street, which is just up the street from Wall Street heading towards City
Yeah.
Hall. There was that, I don't know what style that building was, but they basically rehabbed the whole building, which looks fantastic. And then they put the new wing, which gives them the more density for them, as opposed to them knocking the building down. And, then you're not going to get something nearly as attractive as what the old building is.
Absolutely. I'll ask one more. Is there going to be any tighter regulation on unpermitted construction yards?
So we rezoned all the industrial zones last year. And we actually put in better definitions in terms of what's a contractor yard versus somebody that's storing trucks versus somebody that's running a full-blown earth processing yard. Because those are the ones that are probably the most problematic because of the dust and the noise that are pretty constant with those activities.
Yeah.
So we further defined all those things and said where you can go, where you can't go, limited the size of certain things, put in greater kind of setbacks and buffering standards for those. But what happens a lot of times, and it's more so with the smaller contractors than the larger ones, it's a little bit of whack-a-mole on our end because it seems that, we find out where they are, where they're in an area where they're not supposed to be. We write a letter, we bring to the hearing officer, they move out, but then they just pop up down the street at a different address. So it's like, all right, now we have to start all over again at the new address. So it's a lot of chasing around. We did try to loosen up the regulations though, to provide more areas where folks can just park the commercial vehicles without doing like the noise generating activities or the dust generating activity on the site. So if you just want to park trucks, specifically if you're like an electrician or a plumber, or you might have store some pipe or conduit or something like that, but you're not parking excavators and large dump trucks and storing piles of material, you're kind of low key and you're just parking vehicles. So we try to loosen that up a little bit and give them a little more flexibility on where they could go.
Okay.
Anybody else? You guys are taking it easy on me.
I'm just sitting contemplating the idea of a variance is to vary the zoning code. If you change the zoning code, I don't see any diminishing the number of variances requested. And people are going to have issues every place they live, whatever condition has brought them to us to vary the zoning code.
Yeah, I think there'll always be a certain amount of that, especially when you're dealing with kind of unique or oddball properties or existing buildings on properties. I think the idea would be you wouldn't get variance applications for, like, if I'm building a new house, you shouldn't be getting a variance application for a new house unless there's some crazy thing where the house has a pond, it's got 2 acres of wetlands and a cliff off the back, okay, that's got a lot of topographic challenges, which might need some assistance from you to make it a viable project. But by and large, the new code should kind of say, no, it's pretty straightforward what the rules are, and this works and this doesn't work.
Well, the typical thing is that somebody says, we're within a foot of being good. Can you vary the distance requirement? The slope is within 1/2 degree of being the required slope. Can you vary the requirement? Those are the typical things we get, which are small. We occasionally get what Lee talked about, which is, please give us forgiveness because we already went and did it. That's kind of rare. We don't typically get those things. And I just don't see, when people bump into this, when we talk about grandfathering, every time you change the zoning code, it has been practiced and held up by the courts that a zone change doesn't require people to make changes to their property just because the zone changed, the zone regulations, excuse me. If the grandfathering has been somehow changed in the state of Connecticut, just let me know, because I'd love to be able to anticipate that.
No, that's like, and last night there was a kind of interesting exchange with a resident about the property. I'm not quite sure if it was the case, but she felt that she was going to get changed from a single family to a zone that allowed single or 2 family. And she said, you're not going to make me do 2 family. I said, no, I'm not. It's completely your choice. If you want to, in our opinion, it gives you options going forward, potentially increases your property value. We don't think it's going to negatively impact your property at all, but we're not telling you have to do it. Zoning gives you options to do things. It tells you what you can do or you can't do, but it doesn't tell you you must build a 2 family because it's allowed in the zone. It doesn't say you have to build a 4-story building just because 4 stories are allowed.
Yeah, but that's not really what I'm talking about. Not that you've offered choices, but rather that we have dicta. We say, the slope can't exceed X. And they say, well, we're almost at X, but not quite. Please vary the requirement. And if you look at statutes, that's really the purpose of the ZBA. And we look at the impact and we figure how close they are, and we decide whether it's fundamental. And we try to see if they really have a real problem without being given the variance.
Yeah, and well, maybe I'll kind of answer that, I guess, or address it in a roundabout way. So I'm sure you've all gone to like some of the training put on where, the Connecticut Bar Association, somebody has talked to you about a variance standard and what a variance is. The planners, we do a law session. We're required to do it every year. And we, and inevitably somebody talks about variances, and usually the attorney that talks about that, their opening line is, well, 94% of the variances that are approved should never be approved. Variance is supposed to be such a high bar that, most of the variances should just be denied. Most boards don't kind of put that mindset to it all the time, which is fine, because I think you try to apply a little bit of common sense to an application, because are you really, if you're making a decision on something, is it really causing a problem to somebody? If you give them an extra foot or 2 of setback relief or something, is it really damaging the kind of zoning fabric of the community? I don't think so. I don't never looked at it that harshly, but I understand the legal threshold that they talk about with that.
Let me give you a really precise example. The zoning department tried to stamp out circular driveways for the most part throughout Norway. And where they discovered them, they cited folks if they hadn't already gotten approval for And it turned out after a while that we had quite a few requests from people to authorize a circular driveway. Is that something that's addressed in your code revision?
Yes, I can, hopefully I'll remember, but I'll email you the page number that it's on. We actually put a little bit of relief in. So the new code, so say somebody's gonna start from scratch, they're gonna knock the house down and build new. The new driveway layout, parking layout has to conform to the new regulations. So they have to provide, if it's a single family house, 2 compliant parking spaces. We understand not everybody is gonna build new. Some of these lots, they're 100 years old and the house is 60, 70, 80 years old on the property. And the reality of things is that the way we live today is completely different than the way we lived when these houses were built. We now have, if you don't have 2 cars, you have 3 cars, or you have 3 or 4 kids that can't leave the house or refuse to leave the house, and they all have a car. You got to park them somewhere. So we have provided a little bit of a relief valve in the regulations to provide the ability to have an additional parking space in that front setback area.
All right,
There are some conditions that go along with that.
Good, excellent, thank you.
I'll send you that. We put some conditions on it, but we think it's trying to be flexible.
Well, with that concept in mind, there could be others. And so we're gonna have people come into the ZBA saying, we can't really fit into this. We want you to vary the regulation. And that's pretty much what we get now. And in minor changes, we typically approve them if it is more than minor and significant, then we ask them to demonstrate how they would be harmed by us turning them down.
I actually have a question about the 1 and 2 family situation. You seem to say that if it looks, the width is fine. Is there no indication that you have to have an acre or half acre to put 2 houses next to each other? Could it be on a postage size stamp plot of land? How do you regulate that?
So you're gonna have to, you'll have the required width on the street, but you're also, and I didn't mention this, you're gonna have to provide a lot circle as well, which starts at the front setback, and that varies by the zone. I'm not sure if you know Brian Baker, my office, he does a lot of work with the zoning commission as well. He's actually looking at every 1 acre lot, which is a lot of lots, and he's trying to see what's plausible, what's not plausible in terms of additional lots that are going to get created or could get created with this. I think the areas where you might see a few extra lots, but I don't think it's going to be that much, is if you're on a corner property and you have a fairly large lot, excuse me, because if you think about it, a corner, you have 2 streets. So you have the width on street A and the width on street B. So you could hit that number, but you have to provide that circle as well. So that starts at the front setback line. And that's like it's, if you think about it, it's 100-foot, potentially 100-foot diameter circle, depending on the zone. So each one of those lots has to provide that circle at the setback line. So it's going to cut up a lot of the available property. So I don't think it's going to lead to a big proliferation. And the other thing that disappears is the rear lot, because there's no longer, they have to have the frontage on the street. So that, I think at the end of the day, it's not going to lead to a big increase in like new development from subdivision, but we're still running numbers on that to make sure. And if it looks like we're going to be wrong, we'll, in the single family zones, we'll look at putting the minimum lot size back in. But I don't think at this point, what we've seen, it's going to be a problem.
Yeah, because I'm surprised sometimes. I see the recess in the properties and I don't realize it until I look in my head and see that there's another property behind what I just thought was the driveway. The other thing that's disconcerting, I don't know, it's maybe a violation thing, but living in the city and fighting tooth and nail for parking spots, there seem to be a fair amount of spots if you hunt and peck a little bit around here. Why are people given to parking their cars on their front lawn? It just seems really backwater, and I can't figure it out where there's so many cars and no restrictions, no alternate side of the street. Why is that? And how can that be enforced? It's just, I think it's detrimental to any emergency apparatus that might have to enter the property. Fire trucks, the egress is cut off. And it's just out of place.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because we don't regulate, we regulate the parking spaces, not the actual parking. So people do park on the front lawn. So if they create a permanent parking space on the front lawn, you know, they pave it, they gravel it, do something like that, that we, you know, that's a violation per our code. Where they actually park is not what we regulate. There are a couple areas of the city that have been recommended to look at getting a parking pass, like a resident parking pass, to kind of control who's parking where, so you're not overflowing and overcrowding the streets. So that's something else the city's looking at. Yeah, from an aesthetic standpoint, I agree with you.
Yeah, especially around the beach areas, you can see that there are a lot of people that are gonna grab a lot of spots and the residents can be pushed aside. I see some validity in doing that, giving people an even chance to park close to their house with a pass. Thanks.
Yep.
You know, that the issue that was just brought up about parking on the lawn, it would seem to me that you might want to coordinate with DPW and the fire marshal. DPW for curb cuts and the fire marshal for access for emergency vehicles.
Yeah, we do actually with DPW now, and where it comes in more frequently is when they're doing a whole street repaving. Because they, you know, they have standards in terms of, you know, you're only supposed to have one driveway and the curb cut's only supposed to be a certain width. So they'll come talk to us to say, you know, this guy's got an apron that covers the entire property. Where's his permitted driveway supposed to be? And we'll tell them, and then they'll go in and pave, but then they'll put up the curbing and that takes away the parking space. And then at the same time, if they have an illegal parking space, we cite them and make them bring that into compliance. I can't say 6 months later, they won't go back and do the same thing, but we do get them at that point in time.
Well, if we're worried about emergency vehicle access, I think the fire marshal could be empowered to enforce forcing people to remove cars from lawns.
Okay, I can follow up on that one as well.
And it is getting worse. So it is something we should tackle.
Anybody else? Only 7:30.
Nothing for me. I think it's been absolutely terrific, and I'm particularly impressed by all the stuff on the website. I guess I should have looked at more of it, but I didn't get a chance to do the deep dive on certain areas. It's truly impressive.
Well, I can tell you, well, thank you, but I can tell you that we found so many mistakes so far, which I hate to say, because we've scrubbed this document about 5 times. And I'm still finding things like, oh, that doesn't make sense. So we do have edits to make. So we're going to have a whole laundry list of staff corrections that will go into the final version. And I'm sure we're going to miss some again. And it's just, you know, from my perspective, we're kind of trying to start with a clean slate with the zoning and, you know, see what makes sense. And hopefully over time, it'll lead to more uniformity and just, you know, more well thought out process.
I think it's very impressive personally.
Steve, did Steve Ferguson join us?
I don't see his name up there. No, not as far as I could tell.
So if he should get the briefing. You probably have other neighborhood briefings that he could attend as long as he's told about them. Maybe Tammy could pass the information on to him.
Yeah, and we'll have this, your meeting's getting recorded, so it'll go up in the city's YouTube page. And I'll have that out in the new information sheet, so the link will be right there and we can pass it on. He can.
Very good, thank you.
Doing the same dog and pony show pretty much wherever we go.
One last thing from me. I was on the planning commission, I guess it was 14 years ago, when the prior plan of development and conservation was drafted and approved. And there was, I mean, it was put up on the shelf. I'm hoping that with this rewind of the zoning regulations, that the plan of development and conservation will be more enforced and more utilized than the previous one.
I can tell you this with a lot of certainty. I can't speak for every city department, but the branch that I'm in, which is the Economic Community Development Branch, everything we've looked at that we can look at, we've done or implemented already. The rewrite of the zoning regulations was one of the principal goals within the POCD. So that one was done. East Norwalk TOD study was a goal. The industrial zone study, which we did, was a goal. We're doing an affordable housing plan. And one thing I think, which will be probably one of the major focus areas of my group over the next 5, 10, maybe longer, will be more looking at climate and resilience issues. We're doing a study with Circa right now on, if we get sea level rise scenarios, there are certain areas of the city which might not be accessible. So how do we get in front of that? And what's the cost of these things and what does it mean? What should we do? So that's what we're looking at now. And we're going to kind of expand that out through the city. Do we look at hardening the coastline in certain areas? Do we try to let the water go where it's going to go in certain areas? What are the best methods? So that's going to be a big focus area of my group going forward.
Okay. And one last inquiry. Again, when I was working on the planning commission, one of the items up for discussion was the creation of an architectural review board for Norwalk. Most of the surrounding communities have such boards, and they're an important and integral part of the approval process. Was there any consideration of establishing an ARC?
So Lee, if you could do me a favor, just cover your ears and I'll tell the rest of the group my opinion on that.
Oh, you can tell me. I know how some of your predecessors felt.
Yeah,
Both,
I'm not a fan of architectural review board. What we do though, and I think it works really well. In certain projects, it's made a huge difference. We do have outside peer review architects that are required
I know.
within certain village district applications. And
Yes.
you don't always see what they're doing day to day, but you can see the impacts and the projects when they get approved from like the first iteration of the plan to the final one. There was an application that was proposed on 49 Van Zant Street, which is in the new TOD zone, which has probably the most specific standards of any zone in the city. That application was withdrawn. We tried to get them to withdraw it before they really went far with it, but they decided to go forward, and our peer review architect, and just paraphrasing, but he ripped it to shreds. He said this, so he basically told the commission, don't approve this. It's just, in addition to all the aesthetic problems with the application, it just does not conform to what the goals and intent of the zone are. So we use that as a pretty effective tool. It's in place in probably 3 or 4 zones in the city, and hopefully the form-based code eliminates some of that. But I think in specific areas, like the next one we're going to work on is Rowayton. So they have a village district, but it's a village district with no teeth because they don't have any design standards. So it's hard to tell somebody that your project is inconsistent. Even if you had an architectural review board, they may make changes. But if I was an applicant and I designed something which I said was in keeping with the Rowayton Avenue Village District, you told me no, and I would say based on what? And you wouldn't have any standards to point to tell me I was wrong. And I think I win that argument. So now we're going to put in standards to say, this is what the design should look like. This is what we want in terms of the building massing, the type of materials, the roof lines, all the terminology that 10 times more than me and what actually means and how it works. But all that gets articulated into a separate document, which hopefully makes it more clear and really lays out the vision of what a specific part of the community wants to look like.
Okay. Thank you.
We ready to wrap?
I'll second that.
And please reach out if you ever have any questions. You can get me directly or, reach out through Tammy and she'll come bother me right away. She always does. So no problem at all.
Really good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Have a good
Steve.
night.
Very informative.
Thank you for the briefing.
Sure. You're welcome.
Thanks, Steve.
Yep.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.